Have you ever had that moment where you know what you want to say in English? You feel it clearly inside you, but when you open your mouth, everything comes out smaller, weaker, slower than you meant. And then you start thinking, maybe I sound childish. Maybe I sound confused. Maybe people can hear my mistakes. So you pull back. You speak less. You choose safe words. You avoid the conversation you actually want to have. Now, here is a hard truth that I've seen again and again with adult English learners. The biggest problem is not your grammar. It's not your vocabulary. It's what happens to your confidence when pressure shows up. When the moment feels important, your brain starts protecting you. You start translating. You start editing. You start trying to be perfect, and your real voice gets stuck behind that wall. Today, I want to do something a little different. I want to tell you a true story in clear, natural English about power, control, and the way people can be influenced when they feel afraid, uncertain, or desperate for stability. It's the story of the rise and fall of Adolf Hitler. And before you wonder why we're going there, let me explain what I mean by a lesson in power and control. This is not about admiration. This is not about glamour. It's about understanding how it happened, how ordinary people can be pulled into something destructive, and how language, emotion, and pressure can shape decisions. And as you listen, I want you to notice something else too. Notice how your brain reacts to a serious story in English. Do you understand more than you think you do? Do you follow the timeline? Do you catch the meaning even when you don't know every single word? That ability right there, the ability to keep going without panicking, is the same ability you need in real conversations, not perfection. Forward motion. So let's step into the story. Germany, after World War I, was a country in pain. People were exhausted. The economy was unstable. Money lost value. Jobs disappeared. Families worried about food, rent, and the future. And when life feels chaotic, people don't just want solutions. They want simple answers. They want someone to say, "This is why your life is hard, and this is who is responsible, and this is what we're going to do about it." That emotional hunger, that need for certainty, is one of the most important parts of this story. Because when you're calm and secure, you can think critically. You can question people. You can say, "Wait a second, does that make sense?" But when you're scared, when you feel humiliated, when you feel like the world is moving against you, your brain is not looking for a debate. It's looking for safety. It's looking for strength. And that is when a strong speaker can become incredibly dangerous. Adolf Hitler was not born into power. He wasn't from a royal family. He didn't rise because he had the best ideas for everyone's future. He rose because he understood emotion, and he learned how to perform confidence. And yes, I'm using that word on purpose. Perform. Because confidence is something you can show even when you don't truly have it inside. A lot of my students think native speakers are confident because we're correct. But in real life, it's often the opposite. People sound correct because they sound confident. They speak like they belong in the room, and others start treating them that way. Hitler served as a soldier in World War I, and after the war, he stayed connected to nationalist politics. He joined a small political group that later became the Nazi Party. At first, it wasn't some unstoppable force. It was one of many groups in a loud, messy political environment. But Hitler had something that many politicians didn't. He knew how to speak in a way that made people feel something immediately. He used simple messages. He repeated ideas. He created an us versus them feeling. And he promised a return to greatness, a return to pride, a return to control. And if you've ever struggled with English and felt embarrassed, you might understand, just emotionally, what pride and humiliation can do to a person. When someone feels small, they often search for a way to feel big again. That's a human thing. The tragedy is when a leader takes that feeling and turns it into hatred and violence. If you're enjoying this style of learning, by the way, do me a quick favor. Subscribe to the channel so you can keep learning through real stories like this. And if you want, hit like so the video reaches more learners. And I'd honestly love to hear from you in the comments. What situations make you freeze up in English? Is it meetings, phone calls, small talk, job interviews? Tell me where the pressure shows up for you. All right, back to the story. In the early 1920s, Hitler and his party tried to take power by force in an event known as the Beer Hall Putsch. It failed. He was arrested and sent to prison. Now, you might think that would be the end. A failed attempt, a prison sentence, case closed. But this is where we see something important about ambition and image. Prison didn't erase him. In some ways, it gave him a new kind of attention. And while in prison, he wrote a book called Mein Kampf, where he laid out many of his ideas, including aggressive nationalism and violent hatred, especially toward Jewish people. This is one of those moments in history where the warning signs were there in writing, and still the world didn't stop what was coming. When Hitler was released, he made a key decision. Instead of trying to take power through force right away, he would take power through the system. He would use elections, speeches, public image, and persuasion. And that strategy worked because Germany's situation got worse before it got better. Then came the Great Depression at the end of the 1920s and early 1930s. Economies around the world suffered, and Germany was hit hard. Unemployment rose, fear rose, anger rose. And in moments like that, extreme voices can start sounding reasonable to people who feel desperate, not because the ideas are good, but because the emotions are strong. Hitler's speeches were designed to create a mood. He would talk about betrayal. He would talk about enemies. He would talk about national rebirth. He would promise jobs and order. And he didn't just speak. His party organized rallies, symbols, uniforms, and a sense of belonging. People weren't just voting for a plan. They were joining an identity. This is one of the most uncomfortable lessons in the whole story. Many people don't fall into destructive movements because they carefully studied them. They fall because they feel lonely, powerless, or ashamed, and the movement offers them a new story about themselves. You matter. You belong. You are part of something strong. And if you've ever felt insecure speaking English, I want you to notice something. Insecurity makes us vulnerable. Not just politically, but socially. It makes us hide. It makes us copy. It makes us depend on others to speak for us. The goal in your English is not to sound like a textbook. The goal is to own your voice, even when it's imperfect. In 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. That's a key moment. He wasn't elected as a dictator. He was placed into a powerful position through political deals and misjudgment. Some people around him believed they could control him, use him, manage him. This is a classic mistake with power. People think, he's useful, he's loud, but we can handle him. And then suddenly, they can't. Once he became chancellor, Hitler moved quickly to take more control. After a major fire at the Reichstag building, the government used the crisis to push emergency measures. Civil liberties were weakened. People could be arrested more easily. Opposition could be targeted. And this is how control often grows in real life. Not always in one dramatic moment, but step by step during emergencies, when people are willing to trade freedom for the feeling of safety. Soon, political opponents were suppressed. Independent institutions were pressured. And the Nazi Party worked to become the dominant force in German life. In 1934, after President Hindenburg died, Hitler combined positions and became the central authority, calling himself the Führer. Now, I want you to take a breath here, because this part of the story can feel heavy. But I also want you to notice how your English listening is holding up. You're following a serious topic. You're tracking time. You're understanding cause and effect. That is real language skill. That's what matters. As Hitler's power grew, propaganda became a daily tool. Newspapers, radio, posters, education, public events, all of it pushed the same messages again and again. And when you hear the same message enough times, especially when it connects to fear or pride, it starts to feel normal. It starts to feel like common sense. People stop questioning it, not because they're stupid, but because repetition is powerful. Social pressure is powerful, and fear is powerful. The regime also used scapegoats, blaming certain groups for Germany's problems. Jewish people were targeted especially, along with many others. Discrimination became policy, and then it became something far worse. The Holocaust, the mass murder of millions of Jewish people and other victims, is one of the darkest parts of human history. I'm not going to describe it in detail here, but it matters to say it clearly. This is where hateful ideas and total control can lead. It's not just rhetoric. It becomes real suffering on a massive scale. Meanwhile, Hitler pushed Germany toward war. He broke agreements, expanded the military, and took territories. Some countries tried to avoid conflict, hoping he would stop. He didn't. In 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and World War II began in Europe. At first, Germany had major military successes, and success can create its own kind of illusion. When things are going well, people start believing the leader is unbeatable. They start believing the leader has a special genius. But power can make people reckless, and it can make leaders believe their own myth. One of the biggest turning points was Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union in 1941. It opened a massive, brutal front in the East. The war became bigger, longer, and more destructive. And then, after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the United States entered the war. Over time, Germany faced stronger and stronger opposition, and the early momentum began to collapse. Inside Germany, life became harder. Cities were bombed, resources were limited, families lost loved ones, and yet, even then, the regime continued to demand loyalty and obedience. Because once a leader builds a system based on control, it becomes very difficult to admit failure. Admitting failure would mean admitting the story was a lie. And for many people, that's emotionally unbearable. By 1944 and 1945, Germany was losing. The Allies advanced from the west, and Soviet forces advanced from the east. Berlin became the final center of power, and Hitler's world narrowed down to bunkers, meetings, and denial. That's another lesson about control. When control starts to break, the person at the center often becomes more isolated, more paranoid, more detached from reality. They don't suddenly become humble. They often become more extreme. In April 1945, with Berlin surrounded, Hitler died by suicide. Germany surrendered shortly after. The war in Europe ended, leaving enormous destruction and grief behind. And what the world saw, clearly, was not just the fall of one man, but the results of a system built on manipulation, fear, and dehumanization. Now you might be thinking, Tom, this is history. What does this have to do with my English? A lot, actually. Not because your English is connected to this story directly, but because the psychology is connected. The way humans respond to pressure, the way confidence can be performed, the way repetition shapes belief, the way fear makes the mind smaller. These patterns show up everywhere, including inside you when you speak a second language. Let me explain what I mean. Many of my students walk into a conversation already defeated. Before they speak, they imagine the listener judging them. They imagine the awkward pause. They imagine the mistake. And then they try to control everything. They try to control every verb tense, every word choice, every sound. They hold their breath. Their shoulders rise. Their voice gets quieter. And then they tell me, I know English, but when I speak, I can't. That is a control problem, not control like politics, control like anxiety. Your brain is trying to prevent danger, even though there is no real danger. And the more you try to control every detail, the less fluent you become. Fluency is not control. Fluency is flow. It's the ability to keep moving even when it's messy. In the story we just talked through, we saw how people can be pushed towards simple answers during complex problems. In English, your brain wants simple answers too. It wants the perfect sentence before you speak. It wants certainty. But real conversation doesn't work that way. Native speakers don't wait for perfect sentences. We start talking, and we adjust as we go. We correct ourselves, we rephrase, we add details, we change direction in the middle of a sentence. And no one panics, because that's normal. So here's something I want you to practice, even just mentally, as you listen to me right now. When you don't know a word, do you stop? Or do you keep going with a simpler word? When you're not sure about a grammar point, do you freeze? Or do you keep moving with what you have? That skill, the ability to continue, is the difference between someone who speaks and someone who stays silent. Another lesson from this story is about repetition and messaging. Hitler's propaganda worked partly because it was everywhere, all the time. Now, I'm obviously not comparing learning English to propaganda in a moral way. I'm talking about the mechanism. Your environment shapes you. What you hear every day becomes your normal. If you only hear English in stressful moments, like tests, presentations, or formal meetings, your brain will connect English with pressure. But if you hear English in normal moments, like walking, cooking, driving, relaxing, your brain starts to connect English with daily life. That's why listening to long, calm English like this can help more than you think. You're teaching your nervous system that English is safe, English is familiar, English is something you can be inside of without fighting. And one more thing, and this is big. Power often depends on the story people tell themselves. The story of who is strong, who is weak, who is allowed to speak, who deserves attention. And adult English learners often carry a painful story like this. I am intelligent in my language, but in English, I sound stupid. I sound like a child. People don't see the real me. I need you to hear me on this. You do not become less intelligent when you speak English. You become less comfortable. There's a difference. The real you is still there. Your humor is still there. Your opinions are still there. Your personality is still there. It's just harder to deliver it quickly. And the only way through that is reps, real practice, real speaking, real risk. Let me give you a very real example I've seen so many times. A student in a meeting wants to disagree with a coworker. In their head, in their native language, the thought is sharp and clear. But in English, they start thinking, how do I say this politely? What if I sound rude? What if I make a grammar mistake and people ignore me? So they say nothing. Later they feel frustrated, maybe even ashamed. In that moment, the problem wasn't vocabulary. The problem was permission. They didn't feel they had permission to speak imperfectly, but you do. You're allowed to sound like an international professional. You're allowed to have an accent. You're allowed to pause. You're allowed to rephrase. Instead of trying to craft the perfect sentence, you can use simple, strong English. You can say, I see it a little differently, or I'm not sure I agree, or can I push back on that, or let me explain my concern. And then you explain it in the simplest way you can. Simple is not weak. Simple is clear. And that connects back to the story. Dangerous leaders often use simple language to create emotional reactions. In your life, you can use simple language for clarity and honesty. You can use it to express yourself without fear. Now, as we come closer to the end, I want to land this in a calm, practical place for you. Because heavy history can leave you with a heavy feeling. So here's the takeaway I want you to keep. The rise of Hitler shows us that fear plus uncertainty makes people easy to influence. The fall shows us that control built on lies eventually breaks. And when it breaks, it takes a lot down with it. And for your English, the message is this. Fear plus perfectionism makes you easy to silence. It makes you easy to shrink. It makes you easy to hide. And I don't want that for you. I want you to take your space in English, even if your English is still growing, especially if your English is still growing. So the next time you speak, aim for connection, not performance. Aim for meaning, not perfection. Aim for steady, not fast. And when you make a mistake, don't treat it like danger. Treat it like proof that you showed up. If you want a simple mental shift, try this. Instead of asking yourself, did I say that correctly? Ask, did they understand me? And if they understood you, you did it. You communicated. You used English for its real purpose. And if they didn't understand you, it's still not a failure. It just means you try again with different words. That's not embarrassing. That's normal conversation. All right, take a breath. If this episode felt intense, that's okay. Serious stories can be powerful teachers, not just for language, but for understanding how humans think and react. And the fact that you stayed with me through a difficult piece of history in English, that's something you should quietly respect about yourself. Keep listening. Keep speaking. Keep showing up as you are, not as some perfect version of yourself that only exists in your head. Confidence comes from evidence, and evidence comes from doing. And if you want, before you go, leave a comment telling me one situation where you want to feel more confident speaking English. I read those, and they help me choose future episodes that actually match your real life.